They buried me alive to steal my home, but I came back with the keys and exposed them to the world. Before the video starts, don't forget to subscribe and activate the bell. I never liked depending on anyone. Maybe it's pride, maybe it's instinct. I grew up this way. I ate when I had food, I sewed what tore, I fixed even cracked pots with wire. After Joao passed away, the house became too big. That's what they say. But to me, it was just the right size. The size of my story. I had my corner for coffee, my bookshelf, the garden where I planted the jabuticaba tree on the day our daughter was born. The kitchen faucet had been dripping for years, but I knew its rhythm. It was like a clock that kept me company during the nights when sleep disappeared. No one understands this. No one wants to understand. That Tuesday, I woke up early as always. It was still dark when I put the water on the stove and went to open the front window. The morning air felt different that day, heavy. The birds hadn't sung yet. I sat on the porch with my enamel mug and the newspaper rolled under my arm. When I went to take the first sip, I heard the gate creak open. My eldest son, Roberto, entered without ringing the bell. Behind him, a woman in a white coat and a man in a blazer with a clipboard in his hands. They didn't say good morning. They just entered. The woman looked around as if assessing a place for sale. The man introduced himself as Dr. Morrow, a clinician specializing in forensic geriatrics. I didn't even understand what that meant at first. Mrs. Benedetta, we received a request from your children. We are here to ensure your well-being. My well-being is insured, I replied, standing up, the mug firm in my hand. I've lived here for over 40 years. I've never needed anyone to take care of me. Roberto pretended to be concerned. He spoke slowly, like someone trying to calm a frightened animal. Mom, you've been forgetting things. We came to help you. It's just a period of observation. A good, comfortable place. Just until you get better. Better from what? From aging? I froze when the so-called doctor read a paper that said I would be removed by court order, based on a psychiatric report. A report I had never seen. A process that went on without me ever being heard. They treated me like a dry leaf, ready to be swept away. I was taken as if I were a terminally ill patient. The woman in the white coat grabbed my arm firmly, and Dr. Morrow kept saying technical things to mask the emotional kidnapping that was happening. Risk of dementia, recurring delusions, social isolation. As if drinking coffee alone on the porch were a clinical symptom. At the door of the house, I looked back. I saw my fern wilting, the faded cushions, the wedding photo with Joao still crooked on the wall. That wasn't just a house. It was my altar. And they were tearing me away from it like they were throwing out a stranger. In the car, I didn't cry out of fear. I cried out of anger. Anger at seeing the cold gleam in my own son's eyes, the same one I once saw in a real estate agent. Anger at not having screamed. At not having spat in that doctor's face. But what could I do? I was old. And when you get old, everything you say is considered an exaggeration. We arrived at a beautiful house, large, with a golden sign at the entrance. Residential Viver Melhor, Premium Geriatric Center.
Premium, they said.
As if that could return the dignity they forcefully took away. Inside, everything gleamed. Marble floors, a reception smelling of lavender, and a giant TV playing a cooking channel. But it was too silent. A silence that screamed. They welcomed me as if I were checking into a hotel. Welcome, Mrs. Benedetta. Here, you will have all the care in the world. Behind the sweet words, I saw eyes evaluating, measuring, analyzing. They took me to a room with a hospital bed, side rails, and a beige armchair. No pictures, no books, no my cups. Everything sterile, clean, empty. They signed papers as if they were delivering a package. I sat on the bed for hours. My trembling hands in my lap. My head raised. I didn't cry anymore. I swallowed each tear like I was swallowing lead. This was prison. But a prison without bars, without handcuffs, because the greatest prison is when no one believes you. For the first time in my life, I felt like they were killing me while I was still alive. Burying me slowly, with sweet words and clean pillows. And no one on the outside heard my scream. But I heard it. And in that silence they imposed on me, I swore to myself, if they are burying me, they will regret the day they forgot that I am Root. On the first day, I didn't sleep. It wasn't fear. It was a silent vigil. I refused to close my eyes in that place. Every detail seemed carefully designed to convince me that I was safe. Hospital bed, with an orthopedic mattress. Iron sheets. A window with a beige curtain. But the lock on the outside of the door made it clear. This was a cell. The next morning, they woke me with a tap on the shoulder and a fake smile. "Time for your medicine, Mrs. Benedetta," said a young woman in a white coat, holding a silver tray. "What medicine?" I asked. She didn't answer. She just smiled again and said, "It's just to regulate your blood pressure and calm you down a little, okay?" I didn't take it. I hid the pill under my tongue and spit it out as soon as she left. On the breakfast tray, 3 cookies, a warm tea, and a cut-up fruit. I looked around. 3 elderly women napped in front of the TV. A man in a wheelchair stared at the floor as if waiting for someone who would never return. I realized quickly. Inside, time didn't pass, it rotted. The nurses moved in silence, all with light steps and glassy smiles. The patients were treated like children, even when they tried to speak with clarity. If someone complained of pain, they would say, "It's not hurting, it's just an impression." If someone said they wanted to go home, they responded, "But this is your home now." In there, even the truth became a symptom. I decided to stop reacting. I began to observe, to listen to the conversations in the halls, to remember faces, names, expressions. And that's how I noticed Celia. She wasn't like the others. Her eyes didn't smile when the smile came to her mouth. She seemed like someone who was there out of necessity, not vocation. But she wasn't bad. One night, she saw me looking out the window and cautiously approached. "You don't look sick, Mrs. Benedetta." I stared into her eyes. I didn't say anything. She continued, "I've seen many people come in here with a clear mind and leave blank. It's not Alzheimer's, it's loneliness that does that. The medicine just helps push the rest." I remained silent for a while. Then I asked, "Do you believe me?" She didn't answer with words. She just began treating me differently. Discreetly, she left my tray a little more full. She took me outside to get some sun when the others were sleeping. And one late afternoon, she gave me something that would change everything, a little blue notebook. "Write here what you remember. Write everything. This could be useful one day." I began to write. Every shift change. Every phrase spoken in a low voice. The pills they tried to give me. The names of the medicines. The women who cried at night. One day, I overheard an employee telling another about the lawyer who got a quick guardianship for another patient in less than 15 days. I wrote that down too. That wasn't care. That was commerce. And then one morning, I saw Donna Maddalena being carried to her room, screaming. "They want my land," she was yelling. "Let me go. This is a crime." The nurses said, "She's confused again, poor thing." She was drugged in minutes. At lunch, she was asleep with her head fallen to the side. No one spoke of her again. That day, I understood. I was just another number in this profitable old age catalog. I started pretending to forget things. I pretended to mix up dates, names, the children. Once, I even called a caregiver mommy. They laughed. They began to consider me calm, cooperative. It was all I wanted. Celia noticed what I was doing. One day, she whispered to me, "How long are you going to keep pretending?" I replied without hesitation, "Until they hear me from the outside." At night, in my room, with the door slightly open, I began talking to myself as if I were delirious. But each word was a memory thrown to the wind. If someone were listening, they might have understood that this confused, old woman was actually mapping the hell where she had been buried alive. Celia brought me another gift, an old cell phone. It doesn't have a chip, but it records. Use it carefully. She hid the device inside a metal lunchbox. I almost cried. Not out of gratitude, but out of anger for having to thank for a gesture that, in reality, was just what every human being should have, a voice. I began recording short audios at night, under the blanket, telling everything. My words were like matches in a dark cave. I didn't know if anyone would ever hear them, but lighting them was my only defense against being erased. By this point, I already knew. They had locked me up not out of pity, but out of interest. They called me sick because it was easier to erase my identity than to respect it. Declaring someone incapacitated became a shortcut to stealing in silence. But I wasn't dying. I was nurturing a revolt. Each day in that white prison was a push toward the abyss, or a step toward my return. And I was already climbing. Have you ever screamed inside a well? You scream, and only hear the echo. That's how I felt for weeks. I spoke in silence. My recordings at night were war diaries. I started giving fake names to the perpetrators, creating codes, because I suspected they were listening through the cracks. Paranoia is a faithful companion of those who have been silenced by force. But in a world where everything is anesthetized, lucid pain is an act of resistance. The old cell phone became my confidant. I spoke to it softly, like one prays, narrating every abuse, every medicine administered without consent, every time an elderly woman was treated like a used object. This is Benedetta Souza. I'm not dead. They are killing me slowly, in the name of care. Then, one day, at breakfast, I heard a noise coming from the cafeteria. Commotion. A scream. This is a crime. She died because you sedated her too much. It was a man's voice. Followed by another, colder. You can't accuse a geriatric center like that. We have reports. Madalena, the woman who screamed about the land, had died in the early morning. Cardiac arrest, they said. But her little mouth was still stained blue, the sedative they gave her by force. Her children came to collect her belongings and leave as quickly as possible. They received an envelope. A funeral expense support. Bought silence. Erased memory. That hurt me like a knife. I saw the future they planned for me. To die quietly, with a clean report and a sealed coffin. My body buried and my house sold, divided between children who never asked me what I wanted. It was that day I decided I wouldn't just escape. I would expose. Celia, my only ally, was taking more and more risks. She hid papers I scribbled on. She passed notes in juice boxes. One night, she told me, I have a cousin who's a journalist. She's not famous, but she's tough. I can try to send your recordings. She gave me a bundle with a cell phone hidden inside a shampoo bottle. That was my scream out of the well. 2 days later, I learned the audio had reached her. The cousin had listened to everything. She cried. She committed. She would investigate, look for records, cross names of reports with deaths, dig into the finances of the home. It was a spark, but in silence, it was already a fire. And then, for the first time in weeks, I slept. The next day, the atmosphere was strange. Tense staff. A man in a suit talking to the director. Door closed. The word accusation whispered in the hallways. I pretended to be deaf, sleepy, harmless. But inside, the old Benedetta danced with anger and hope. That night, Celia came to my room. Something's going to happen. I felt the tension. They're going to try to transfer you. Make you disappear. I remained silent. You'll have to leave before. I know a way out. But there's only one chance. I looked at her and said, if it's to leave, it's not to hide. It's to show what they did to me. Celia smiled with her eyes and said, then you'll need more than courage. You'll need witnesses.
She organized it.
In 3 days, we managed to discreetly talk to other lucid patients like Donna Iracema and SU Paulo. They all had stories. They all were afraid. But little by little they began to speak. We recorded in secret. Celia edited everything into one file and sent it to her journalist cousin. It was the dossier of the White Death nursing home. And then came the night of the escape. Celia took me to the laundry room. We crossed service corridors, narrow stairs, until a rusty little door at the back. A complicit gardener left the door slightly open. Outside, a car was waiting. When I got in the car, I felt the street air. The smell of freedom mixed with fear. I wasn't free yet, but I was alive. And now, no one was going to silence me. I was taken to a small apartment, hidden. The journalist came to see me the next day. Young, her eyes inflamed with indignation. We spent hours talking. She listened, read the notebooks, watched the audios. Mrs. Benedetta, this isn't just a story. This is a bomb. Then blow it up. But blow it up with names, addresses, documents. She promised. Days later, the report came out. Premium Residential accumulates accusations of abuse, forced sedation, and appropriation of elderly people's assets. My voice opened story. The recording of the audio I made crying in the dark. It was my scream finally heard. The repercussion was immediate. Social media exploded. TV shows called. Deputies were outraged. The public prosecutor's office opened an investigation. Other families came forward, telling similar stories. I was called the elderly woman who had courage. But I didn't want a medal. I wanted justice. And it was just beginning. They called me crazy. Now they called me brave. But I wasn't deluding myself. Deep down, the country that listens moved by the stories of a surviving elderly woman is the same one that silences thousands every day. I was an exception only because I escaped. And screamed loud. The story hit like lightning. But I knew that thunder isn't enough. You need fire to burn the roots of what rots us. In a week, other elderly people from different shelters contacted the journalist. 3 were lucid. One had lost his home after an emergency guardianship signed by a complicit judge. Another was isolated, with no access to his bank statement for 2 years. The 4th? He died the day after the report. Official cause: sudden drop in blood pressure. A pattern was beginning to emerge. An entire system of legalized theft hidden behind the discourse of care. What they called geriatric assistance was, in fact, a machine to erase identities in exchange for properties, pensions, and silence. A billion-dollar business. And I, Benedetta Souza, became the face they couldn't erase. I was called to testify before the public prosecutor's office. I was received like a war survivor. But I made sure to remind them, I'm not the exception. I'm the portrait. Thousands are where I was. And many don't have a Celia to help them escape. The prosecutor, who heard me, had lowered eyes. Perhaps out of shame. Perhaps out of fear of what he discovered. My recordings, my notebooks, the hidden notes, the photos of bruises on women's arms, all now part of a federal investigation. But not everyone was happy about my return. My children, oh, my children. They called me for a conversation. A cold office, coffee served in porcelain cups. First came the smiles. Mom, it's so good to see you're well. Then, the attempt to control. Maybe you overreacted, you know? These things become a spectacle. Finally, the cynicism. You're getting older, isn't it better to let this go? I looked at them, my voice unwavering. I don't want you to pay for being bad. I want you to pay for thinking I was weak. They fell silent. For the first time, they heard me as a woman, not as an obstacle. Justice began to act. The premium residential facility was shut down. The director was arrested. Doctors who signed false reports were suspended. Employees who had been silent under duress began to speak. It was the domino effect of exposed terror. But I wanted more. I wanted it to be recognized that there is violence in forced institutionalization. That guardianship cannot be a weapon for impatient heirs. That the elderly are not a dumping ground for guilt or living inheritance. I wanted the world to understand what it means to age with awareness in a country that silences you with a glass of Rivotril. My lawyer filed a lawsuit against my own children for attempted appropriation of assets and psychological abuse. It was hard, but necessary. One of them cried in court. He said he only wanted the best for me. The judge asked, and the best was locking her up without access to her own money, in a nursing home with a history of abuse? He didn't answer. When the sentence was handed down, I cried. But not out of sadness. It was an old cry, choked, from the little Benedetta who had always been taught to lower her head, to obey, to not make a scene. That tear was my declaration of independence. The decision annulled the guardianship. It recognized my right to autonomy. And more, it ordered compensation for moral damages. Not for the money, but because the harm was real. I went back to my home. The same porch, the same dry plants. But now, the silence was mine, not imposed. And the key in the door was not a symbol of imprisonment, but of return. The press was still looking for me. They asked me to tell the story on television shows, on podcasts, in books. I agreed. Not out of vanity, but because my voice was now a knife. And where there had once been a solitary Benedetta, now there was a chorus of voices breaking the silence over the horrors committed in the name of elderly protection. One of the nurses who helped at the shelter secretly came to me. She wanted to testify. She said, "What you did gave me courage. I saw everything, but didn't know how to scream." I smiled and replied, "Now you know. And you're no longer alone." The house was renovated with help from anonymous donations. I received letters from women in the countryside, from retirees forgotten by their families, from honest caregivers ashamed of the system. A priest sent me a rosary. A high school girl wrote, "I want to be like you when I grow old, with teeth and dignity." And I thought, maybe this is the real judgment of the living, not what happens in courtrooms, but what each person faces when they choose between silence or speaking. I spoke, and the world listened. It was strange to return home. Even after winning in the courts, even after getting my keys back and my name on the documents, it still took time to believe that the world out there wouldn't come and take me again. I found myself sleeping with my purse pressed against my chest, hiding objects under the pillow, as if they were coming to take away the little that was left. Freedom doesn't arrive with fanfare. It whispers, knocks gently, and if you don't open the door with courage, it leaves. But I opened it. Slowly, yes. Afraid, of course. But I opened it. I started replying to every letter I received. So many. Hundreds.
From people who saw themselves in me.
Miss Benedetta, my mother was forced into a shelter and is still there. My grandfather had his house sold, without knowing. I'm elderly too, and I'm afraid my children will do the same to me. Each line was a mirror of my pain. And that's when I understood. My fight was no longer just mine. That's when the seed of what would become the old, free and alive movement was born. It started small. A WhatsApp group. Then a support network with volunteer lawyers, psychologists, honest nurses, conscious children, and most importantly, elderly people who refused to be silenced. We created pamphlets, organized discussion circles, collected video testimonies, created a website for anonymous complaints. And above all, we gave names to things. Because no one fights against what they don't know exists. We called what was once called emergency placement legalized abandonment. We called forced guardianship without a real medical evaluation civil kidnapping. And we called the system that profits from the invisibility of the elderly the economy of silence. The words bothered people. Of course they did. Powerful people tried to discredit us. They said I was manipulated, that my story had exaggerations, that I was being used by ideological groups. But it was enough to show my arm with the mark of restraint. It was enough to look into my eyes. They forget that our bodies remember what they tried to erase. One day, I was called to speak at a public hearing in Brasilia. I walked up to the podium in my simple clothes, my hair tied back, and a notebook full of names. Names of elderly people who died in silence. People no one mourned. People who were buried with the label of incapable, without ever being heard.
I spoke for them.
And when I finished, the room was on its feet.
It wasn't for me.
It was because a wall was beginning to crack. And no one wanted to put cement over it anymore. The response was greater than I imagined. A bill started to circulate, to review guardianship criteria, to prohibit forced interments without a complete judicial report, to guarantee the unrestricted right to communication for elderly people in care. They proposed the law's name, the Benedetta Law. I cried when I heard it, not out of vanity, but because I realized that the old woman humiliated in a room with white tiles, drugged and forgotten, was now shaping laws. And at the same time the Congress was moving, the people were moving too. In several cities across the U.S., elderly groups began to organize. One of them, in rural Texas, called themselves the Stubborn Ones. Another, in Philadelphia, became the Grandparents Who Make Noise. In Seattle, old age without locks emerged. They distributed flyers, demanded meetings with mayors, and exposed hidden nursing homes. The echo of my escape became a collective shout. And that's when I understood what true freedom is. It's not just leaving captivity, it's making sure no one else enters. I received invitations to give lectures, participate in programs, even write a book. I always refused one thing, that they tell my story as an individual miracle. The miracle was surviving, yes. But the victory was not solitary. It was born from listening, alliances, disobedience, and shared courage. And that's why I agreed to participate in the documentary. They called it "They Stole My Voice, Not My Soul." It showed everything, from my first recorded audios to the scenes of the day I returned to my home. It aired on TV. It went viral. Young people started to watch. A group of film students wrote to me, "Ms. Benedetta, because of you, we're doing our final project on institutional violence against the elderly." I smiled. The echo was reaching far. And on a sunny Sunday in a square here in the neighborhood, we held our first big national gathering. People came from all corners, some with canes, others in wheelchairs, many with wrinkles on their faces and fire in their eyes. They carried posters, made banners,
Danced. Sang.
shouted. I looked and thought, these are the ones they tried to erase. And now they light up the world. I took the microphone and said, for a long time, they said the world belonged to the young. And it does. But today, it also belongs to the old who refuse to die in silence. Old age is not the end of the story. It's the chapter where the truth finally has a voice. The crowd applauded. They shouted my name. I trembled. But not from fear, from strength. Because now I knew, freedom, when it echoes, never goes back to the cage. The day dawned gray. The kind of morning that seems to ask for silence. But I was ready to bury it once and for all. I took with me a small, simple wooden crate. Inside, I kept pieces of what I had been forced to hide. The white apron from the shelter, the notebook with tiny, shaky letters, the restraining straps torn from the bed, the plastic bracelet that carried my name as if I were a thing, Benedetta Souza. Under guardianship. Do not medicate without order. It wasn't a public ceremony. It was an intimate ritual. Yet more than 40 people came with me to the vacant lot behind the chapel where I used to pray as a girl. It was symbolic, but no less real, because the pain that silences us needs mourning, and the silence that kills us needs burial. I buried the silence with my bare hands, a shovel, moist earth, and a lump in my throat.
People gathered around me.
Some cried, others prayed. But there, at the center of that hole dug with love and anger, I was leaving not just objects. I was leaving everything they made me carry without ever asking for it.
Shame. Doubt.
The sense of uselessness. Because during those months of captivity, they made me believe that growing old was a mistake. That the world was a place for the agile, the young, the strong. That my presence was a nuisance. That I was a burden. I wasn't. I am a root. And roots are not buried alive.
Roots sustain.
When I threw the last shovel of dirt on the crate, I raised my face and looked around. I found faces like mine. Wrinkled people, but awake. People who had been treated as invalids, as secondary, as shadows. But now they were standing, alive and whole. And there, in that moment, I realized it was no longer the story of an old woman who came back. It was the rebirth of a generation that refused to leave in silence. After the burial, we all sat in a circle. Hot coffee, cornbread, shared memories. An elderly woman with very white hair took my hands and said, "When my daughter took me to a home, I thought it was the end. Today, for the first time in years, I feel like a beginning." I was moved, because that's what I felt too. A new beginning. Even with the aches in my joints, with the internal scars, with my memory sometimes failing, still I was a beginning. In the days that followed, I started writing my memoirs. But not like those autobiographies that romanticize overcoming.
No.
I wrote it as a denunciation, as a scream, as a beacon for those who come after. I named the book, Old, Not Dead. And each chapter ended with an uncomfortable question. The kind that makes you think. The kind that makes a child reflect before deciding their mother's fate. The kind that makes judges look beyond the paperwork. The kind that, if asked earlier, might have spared me. The book became required reading in social work courses, and it ended up in the hands of a Supreme Court justice who quoted a passage of mine in a decision that denied guardianship without a proper multidisciplinary evaluation. My name became case law. But more than justice in books, what moved me was what I saw in the streets. Elderly people with signs. I still breathe, therefore I exist. My old age, my voice. I don't want a home. I want a home with a window. Old ladies with canes protesting in front of public institutions, demanding policy revisions. 80-year-old men giving interviews, saying they didn't want to be buried alive. Grandchildren recording videos with their grandparents, saying, I care, I listen, I respect. It was as if my pain had echoed until it became collective consciousness. And finally, I felt I had done my part. Not as a hero, but as a woman. A woman who was beaten by life, but returned it in words. Who was silenced, but found her scream. Who was buried alive, but came back with the keys. Today, my house is full. Not of people, but of living memories. I receive letters every day. Some come just to have coffee and hear stories. Others ask for advice, blessings, guidance. Sometimes, they ask me if I've forgiven my children. I can't answer with words, but I never excluded them from the book. And I left the last page blank with a dedication. To those who made me fall, but who can still learn how to rise. Forgiveness, to me, is not forgetting. It is transforming pain into a tool. And if one day they want to return, let them come without excuses, but with a willingness to listen. Because now my voice is not just mine. It is from a generation that will no longer be silent. And in this new time, where old age is courage and memory is a weapon, I can finally sit on the porch with my coffee, look at the world outside, and say, I've returned. And I will never return to silence.